Welcome back to another video. This is Oni with Pro-Lit-Fic, and I'm here to show you how to be the best you can be. All right. Reality is, who knows what the best is? Am I the best? Are you the best? It doesn't matter. We're just going to do our best, whatever that looks like. So welcome to this video. So today we're going to talk about career stages, right? And basically, if you were to take somebody off the street and then turn them into the next big thing, what does that mean? And what are all the stages of development they would have to go through? And so these stages I've written out are based off 4 fundamental factors of how we combine what I would call the production pyramid in terms of just how we put out books and build a career. We'll get into all the details of that, but basically it starts from the aspirant, basically someone who aspires to be a writer, has no idea how to, all the way to someone who's the standard of their genre. So that's a Stephen King, a Brandon Sanderson, James Patterson, guys like Tom Clancy, and even, I forgot one, a really important one, J.K. Rowling. I don't know if you've heard of her. If you like to read books and you haven't heard of J.K. Rowling, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? So let's go in and we're going to talk a little bit about the 4 factors before we zoom out and talk about each stage. All right, welcome. So now the 4 factors of production that we need to focus on are going to be infrastructure, craft mastery, and then clarity of story, right? These are tied to the production pyramid's ideas of speed, quality, and cost. And then the 4th factor is you. Now, first, let's talk about what I mean when I say production cost. There is essentially a pyramid of where we have quality, speed, and cost right here. Usually in production, if you are a master of one of these areas, that's usually what it takes to bring something viable to market, right? But if you're going to have a lasting impact for a business in order to be sustainable has to be able to do 1 or 2 of these qualities at a competitive level, right? When you start getting into the realm of like an Amazon, a Microsoft, an Apple, what happens is you do all 3 of these at an exceptionally high level, and that's where you absolutely crush. Specifically in our author principles, we have to figure out how do we build speed, quality, and then reduce cost. So let's talk about what each of these factors mean. First off, infrastructure, which is related to our speed of production. Infrastructure is essentially when I make a manuscript, how well do obviously my writing process, how well do I write and finish that book, moving from my initial draft, so first draft, all the way to getting it read by beta readers. That's obviously to ensure quality. You can take that step out, but this is also part of your infrastructure to maintain quality, right? And then over here, editor. All of these parts of your infrastructure are laden and based in quality, but they ultimately help with your speed, because the focus of this is these factors of speed. If you know how to do this, so if you are a brilliant writer and you don't need an editor, you don't need a beta reader, and you have an mastery of your process, you don't need a developed infrastructure. The issue is most people don't have a developed infrastructure, which then affects their quality. But what is that quality actually affecting, right? That's craft mastery, and that is our second principle. So craft mastery is how well do I understand characters, setting, premise? How well do I know how to plot a book? How well do I outline? This is part of our process, which helps with speed. But knowing that we have a viable quality up to our speed process is the most important, which is why things like editors, beta readers are so essential in helping us get up to speed. So our quality is the standard, right? And then this is where traditional publishing has been short-circuited the most, is the idea of cost. Now, cost is how expensive is this thing to bring to market? Obviously, if something is insanely popular and there's more pre-orders, like if people are willing to pre-order, for instance, a book or a video game or your book and say, we're willing to throw money and we want it so badly before you've even made anything, obviously your cost is extremely low, right? Which means you have a product that is in demand or it's expensive, right? Which means basically so it's very expensive. Oh, sorry. It's meant to be cheap. No. So when it is expensive for you, it is cheap for the customer. When it is cheap for the customer, it is expensive for you. The idea behind making this cost is you want to drive cost all the way down. You want to be as cheap as possible for you to be, which means it's not cheap for the customer. It's not cheap for them. But the reason it's not cheap is because the demand is high. So cost is directly related to demand. The higher your demand, the lower your costs. So as a writer, what you're trying to do is build demand through quality writing that comes out in an appropriate time scale. That's what you're trying to do. When you can do all of these three things effectively, you're now an effective writer. And in order to do that, the fourth factor is you, which is a whole other video. But ultimately, it's understanding that you are the most highest principal factor in driving all of these qualities. So that's that for this part of the video. Let's talk about the different stages. Go. So now these three independent stages are going to dictate kind of where and what your different style of writer is and what your path is. But ultimately, it's going to come down to, it's going to come down to these three factors. So we have speed, which is essentially your process of the craft, how well you write, how well you can do it, how well you can hit those deadlines, right? As well as that plays into your infrastructure for your quality. So how well is the actual manuscript when you put it out, and then cost. So remember, you alone are probably going to be able to master just one of these. If you're fortunate and you're working with someone else, you have a coach, you have someone, you might be able to get another one. But almost always, if you want to have two, it's going to come at a severe cost of the other one. It's kind of like playing a video game, where as you level up one stat, that dips the stats and the output in another. So to keep everything all balanced and everything means you have to have incredibly high output in all three factors, which is very rare and very difficult to do most of the time, which is why so few people do it. But the secret here, and what you're going to learn, is that if you have clarity on what is your strength, then you can build on the other one. And then once you figure out how to get to the higher stages, you can then mitigate the loss of that third factor so that you can then move into the last stage, right? And that's essentially what happens. So let's talk about what each of these factors happens at each stage. So when you're the aspirant, you have lots of excitement and lots of enthusiasm, which means you have you, the fourth factor. That's the mysterious factor. So you have you and you have time. So lots of time, and there's you. Maybe you don't have lots of time, but you're going to need lots of time, because you and your time and your focus is going to be need in the aspirant, where your excitement and you're enthusiastic, and you start learning how to write a book. So you watch videos like this, you start going to writers' conferences, you start doing the things that are needed to start building one of them. Most of the time, most people, when they're building and they're choosing, because you're trying to write a book, you're going to focus on your process and the craft of writing, which is what I'd recommend most people start out with, is you're going to make this your first priority. And you are going to make sure that you understand your writing process and your craft. Most of the time to do this, you have to finish books. So an aspirant, your focus at this stage is you need to finish a project. If you have not finished a book, if you haven't actually put a book down, finished it, and pushed away a manuscript, you're still an aspirant. I don't care how good at writing you think you are. Because remember, even if you have really, really high quality, if you do not have a mastery of the process, you don't have high quality. I don't care how good of a writer you think you are. I can't read something that's not been written. I can't read something that hasn't been finished. And the idea is that I know there's a lot of people who are good writers, but until you finish something, you can't say you have any level of mastery of anything. And so your focus, the very first thing you need to do is finish a book. You're trying to finish a project. That's the very first thing before you think about signing deals and I'm going to go out on the red carpet doing all this stuff. You need to focus on what does it take to finish a project and how do I do that? And if you don't know how to do that, you need to learn. stumble through it, and really learn and master your process. You're not really focusing on understanding the quality. You're just getting through it, making all the mistakes. Now we have the second stage, right? Actually, we'll do a different color because we like to diversify around here. But in the second stage, you're no longer an aspirant. Would call you the isolated artist. So now the reason I say you are the isolated artist in stage 2 is because now that you understand your process, you're now at a point where diligence, discipline, and making a decision become core factors of what it is you're doing. Hold on a second. Okay. So here at the isolated artist, as we see, diligence and decision making is the most important factor. Now, the biggest obstacle you're going to face here is you're going to sense a loss in community. And this is the sad part. About 80% of people who want to write a book never get past here. They never finish a project. So once you've come over here, you're in this 20% of people who are actually finishing stuff and have decided you want to start building something. At this time, you might have an understanding of your process, right? Because here, once you finish a project, you've now come to an understanding of what you're good at in terms of your process. But you've lost your community now. So now you have no essential infrastructure. And you might say, well, what do you mean I lost my community? Because remember, back when you had those writers groups and you were writing and you guys were all fun, but you went and actually finished the book. Well, a lot of them are still stuck in this perpetual cycle of talking about the books, maybe sort of kind of finishing projects, but never actually doing things. And so now you're going to 80-20 Pareto principle yourself out of this by virtue of the fact that you actually went and started working on your process. So now you have a baseline for speed. You have a baseline for speed in your process. You know that it takes 6 months, 4 months, 1 year, 2 years, 8 years, whatever it takes to finish a book. But now, in this second stage, a lot of people will then focus on trying to build up quality versus by virtue of their craft. They think, well, if I get better at my craft, this will build up my quality, and that's how I'll do it because if it's good enough. And that's what it used to happen before, because before your infrastructure was held by traditional publishing companies, but that's no longer the case. So now in the isolated artist stage, the most important thing you can start building now is looking for a community, because that is what you've lost. Because by virtue of stepping into a community, you will then be able to bolster your loss of community that you suffered in the first stage. And then by building this loss of community, you will now then be able to focus on the second part, which is your infrastructure. And then your infrastructure, whether it's editors, beta readers, writing groups, whatever that is, you're now going to be able to start building a baseline for quality. And then from that baseline of quality, you are then going to introduce it into the third stage, which is now going to be based on your cost, or as they say, demand. And you do this because in your first stage, you've mastered your process, maybe not mastered, but you're at a baseline for whatever, however fast that is, right? And now you have a standard of quality because you have beta readers, you have an editor, you have other writers telling you whether your writing's any good. And if you're diligent and solid, the isolation that you're going to feel from this period is going to have been taken care of. And then when you move through that isolation, now you're going to move into the last period, which is where you start having a breakthrough. And we call this period the emergent professional, stage 3. And when you start being an emergent professional, maybe you've made a little money, you maybe won a few short story contests, maybe you even self-published and sold a little few books, but you don't have a really strong mastery of all 3 principles. And you don't necessarily need mastery, but you're not at a market baseline. And at this time, when you're an emergent professional where you are building an audience and now you're building demand for your book, whether it's little or much, now it's simply about calibrating and getting paid for whatever it is you have been making. Now, if you've gotten paid, but you're realizing I'm getting paid very little, that means that your cost is still way too high. It means that it is still too expensive to generate your book, which means you need to start working on demand. And a lot of people think, well, if I write a really, really good quality book and I have good process, this will create demand. No, that's not true at all. There's a lot of people who have demand and make lots of quality in books, but then they don't necessarily have a speed of process or high quality, but they still make tons of money, right? And then they move into this last step because they are usually bolstered by the other two factors, usually through a publishing company or an editor, a producer, somebody else who makes up for it. A good example of this, no offense to her, love her work, love her story, but Twilight is a good example. Because Stephanie Meyer was able to publish her very first book, she generated tremendous amount of demand, which because she was hit into a genre. But the difficulty of that is that when she tried to break out of that, she didn't have a strong understanding of her process, nor the quality checks weren't there. They were good enough to get her stuff published, but they weren't good enough to allow her to expand out, which is now we're going to go into the next stage, which is the established professional. And now at the established professional, you've essentially are able to write full-time. For a lot of people, they're like, yay, I'm full-time. I'm an established professional. And this is where you're able to be a writer. You're making enough money where you have an audience. And I say full-time, but I say full-time like with quotes. Full-time means that you can spend all your time writing if that's all you want to do, but you're not killing it at this stage. You're probably making enough where you're able to make a living, you're able to live a modest life, or maybe if you're single, alone, solo, you're fairly flat over broke, but you're making enough so that you can keep writing. At this time, you have enough of your production pyramid at baselines that now you can start working on bolstering each factor of the pyramid. So whereas the other three factors, you were working on getting baselines for every three. And the thing is, once you have all three and you've established baselines for all three, you will make money writing. It's inevitable if you simply do the steps, right? Because the breakthrough here is simply having an audience and publishing a book and trying to sell it to someone. Just being like, here's my writing, sell it to someone. And then do that enough times until someone pays you for it. And then you realize, oh, I have to go through 20 rejections before, or 2,000 rejections before I get rejected. That establishes your baseline for demand. So then the idea is then, okay, I need to focus on my marketing, which people call, but that's really just demand. Marketing is a way to help with demand, but that's not really the full-time focus of demand, because demand can come through a lot of different ways. But ultimately here, when you're an established professional, the idea is now you're working on all three of these things. And the idea is you're now creating a system where all three of these will feed into each other, where as you write a higher quality book, you will then create demand. And then as you create demand, you will then be able to work into your process, right? Which is, if you have an established infrastructure, that's where we go back to infrastructure being speed, right? Because if you have an established process, by speeding up your process, you then can then build an infrastructure that can support that process. And then after that, you now are building more demand. And then what happens is you're able to advance. And how you jump from being an established professional to becoming a standard really is just how well do you do all three? How well do all three synergize? Because that is what we're looking for at this stage, is your synergy. As your synergy goes up, you now move into the last level, which is that of the standard or masteries. So this is where you get the greatest, the guys who define genres, the guys who can cross genres. Because when you become a market unto yourself as an author, now you are able to write whatever you want. James Patterson, Tom Clancy, Brandon Sanderson, Stephen King, J.K. Rowling. Even though she was a bit of an established professional, the biggest indicator of when you know you're the standard is when you are able to transcend mediums. The reason a lot of authors are never able to get out of this established professional is because people still look at them as writers and not as storytellers, because they haven't built a property or been able to market it or do something to the way that it absolutely transcends the medium. So there's a lot of people who you would say like, okay, well, is Brandon Sanderson officially a standard? I would say he is, right? But he's at the beginning of that because there's no major properties outside of books that he's written. But he's stepping out of it. James Patterson, Tom Clancy, Stephen King, these guys are easy standards. J.K. Rowling, easy standard setter because they've been able to successfully take their stories and get them to be successful across mediums outside of book. Whereas someone like, say, Brandon is still working on it because he's a brilliant writer, but his stories haven't been able to find an audience to transcend mediums fully yet. But he's optioned out movies and stuff like that. So he is pretty much there as like a king of writing, but he hasn't quite set and become a standard household name like a Stephen King, James Patterson, Tom Clancy, etc. And being able to do that again and again and again sets the next stage, but we're not talking about that because that's for people here. A lot of people would be happy to be here, and very, very few people, probably about 0.01% of people who ever write get here, and only about 1% of writers ever get here. So if you get here, you already have differentiated yourself significantly because very few people, only about 10% ever get to the stage of people who want to write, ever get to the stage where they're just on the cusp of a breakthrough. And this is where a lot of the writers and the people I serve with my company serve. So if you know where you are in this stage, and specifically if you're trying to go from here to here, come hit me up for a free strategy session so I can help you figure out where you are in this. Pause. Anyway, thanks so much for the video. I hope that was helpful, just kind of giving you an overview of what the journey can look like as an author and just having an understanding of where you're at and what your obstacles are. So just doing a quick summary. Stage 1, if you want to get through that, finish a project. Stage 2, if you're isolated and feeling like, I feel like I'm good, but I don't know quite how to make a breakthrough, find a community, make some connections. Once you've built these connections and you know how to actually have connections in the community, now you need to start asking for money and publish it and put yourself out there. So self-publishing is the easiest way to break through this. Traditional publishing as well, finding an agent. But the idea is now is you want to focus on selling your stuff, building an audience, and creating demand for your project. This is the one that's the most nebulous, but it really just means telling people to buy your stuff. And then at here, when you have this full-time established author, if you're trying to advance, all you need to do is make sure you create systems and a more powerful infrastructure to connect all three of your production qualities. And then when you've mastered that at this level, transcending all mediums, I don't know. I've not gotten there and I don't have any friends who are there. So yeah, it'll be really cool to see once I get there. Hope all is well. Like and subscribe, and hit me down, like I said, for a free strategy session if you want to know more of how you can implement these steps into your career. Stay happy, stay healthy. Peace.